Alaska is an unspoiled land of natural beauty. Its 663,000 square miles are nourished with over 3 million lakes and 10,000 rivers, making this region unique in all the world.
People who arrived in Alaska encountered a land, a terrain, a climate that they were very much unfamiliar with.
It's beautiful being here, but it's clean. The air is so pristine. The water is so delicious.
It's spectacular. The tundra in the fall is all of those colors in the New England fall, except they're at your feet.
The remoteness made us all cling together in a tighter bond. We needed each other.
The physical environment of Alaska shapes the character and molds the sort of citizen who comes to Alaska.
Reaching far above America's 60th parallel and stretching so far west that it actually crosses into the east, today Alaska is attracting many to this enticing land of opportunity.
The name Alaska comes from an Aleut word, is often loosely translated as the Great Land. And so the term really suggests something of the majesty of Alaska.
Initially, few ventured this far north, but when the cry of gold was heard at Nome in 1898, the migration started and miners flocked to Alaska.
Nome was called the City of the Golden Beaches because there was literally nuggets of gold right there on the beach just waiting to be picked up.
There were 26 ships anchored waiting for the shore ice to go out so that they could unload the miners and all of the people. So the population swelled from about 30 the summer before, the word got out, and then the population went up to about 28,000.
So guys, they heard about the Nome Gold Strike. They came up and just pitched a tent where they could. And so this whole beach was lined with tents.
Sensing a golden opportunity, Edward G. Cannon, a 75-year-old medical doctor and convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, joined the trek and made his way to Nome.
For someone like Edward Cannon to come in, he's a physician, he's a missionary, he's a miner, he has all of these skills, and he would have been welcomed for all of the things that he could bring to that community.
Dr. Cannon's search for gold was multifaceted, not only sifting the sand, but sifting hearts as well. It was here in Nome that he found a pure nugget in the young Kedzie Noble Winnie, who in June of 1902 became the first known person baptized in Alaska into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Just the courage to step out into that water was wonderful. As he lived there, the years that he did, the gold became less important and the gospel became more important in his life.
Noble became a staunch believer and assisted Cannon in teaching others. Over 100 shivering spectators were present on September 10, 1910, to watch Nome's 86-year-old miner baptize the first woman in Alaska, Mrs. Nancy Anthony. Dr. Cannon subsequently fought for his life against a severe cold brought on by the chilling circumstances, and finally succumbed just shy of his 87th birthday. The newspaper greatly lamented the passing of such a pure Christian person like the doctor. It was 18 years later in 1928 when Northwestern State's mission president, William R. Sloan, received approval to send a few strong, experienced men as short-term missionaries into Alaska to lay the groundwork for sustained missionary work there. As a result, Heber J. Meeks, James Judd, and Alvin Engelstad were called to leave their farms, families, and professions in southern Utah for the summer. In Seattle, the three were joined by another missionary, the 20-year-old Lowell Plowman, and together, they boarded the Admiral Rogers for Alaska, arriving in Juneau on June 5, 1928. The following morning, atop Mount Moriah, they dedicated the land of Alaska for the preaching of the gospel.
We do bless this land, set it apart and dedicate it to become a land of Zion, that Israel may be gathered, that churches and even temples may be erected to thy holy name.
Alaska's Governor Parks was pleased to welcome them. The legendary Mormon ability to make the desert blossom intrigued him, and he hoped they could do that within Alaska's challenging climate.
He was accepted by people there who were interested in doing colonizing in Alaska, but that wasn't why my grandfather and these men were there. They were there to plant seeds of the gospel.
The four missionaries visited each major Alaskan city, distributing scores of copies of the Book of Mormon and placing introductory articles on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in each of the newspapers. They filled numerous speaking engagements before local chambers of commerce. But although the people were warm and friendly, few attended actual church services put on by these missionaries. Still, a thaw was underway in the minds of men. It would just be a matter of time before the seeds would take root. The first sprout to pierce the soil came shortly after arriving in Fairbanks on July 4th, 1928. An LDS family, the Watkins, asked the missionaries to baptize their young son. Of course, they agreed, and the ice was broken for the first known baptism in Alaska in nearly 20 years.
And they met a lot of good people, and he always told about how good everybody was to them and what good people they were and how they promised to read the Book of Mormon when they give them to them.
The group then returned to Alaska's southeast, spending additional time in Juneau and surrounding villages. On August 11th, they finally made their way to Ketchikan.
Ketchikan is, I think, the best town in Alaska. We called upon the Mayor Hennigan and had a very interesting talk regarding our work in the city. He stated that we had the same rights as any other religious organization.
Certainly, the Mormons are part of that wave of religious folks who have just come to Ketchikan kind of one after the other, and they've been welcomed, they've been brought to the community. No one has said, oh, you can't be here because you're X, Y, or Z. Ketchikan is a very live and let live area. If someone wants to come here and make the community better, we're all for it.
They were also impressed by Ketchikan's Alaskan natives.
There was a fairly large native community. Because of that, Ketchikan developed into an area now that has more totem poles than just about any other community anywhere in the world.
In all, this missionary foursome placed nearly 1,000 copies of the Book of Mormon that summer before returning to Utah. Elder Plowman remained behind and continued to proselyte with new companions. But the harvest was meager, and the missionaries were eventually recalled from Alaska. In 1938, Preston Nibley, the new mission president, learned of several LDS families who had located to the Fairbanks area, but who were living without a church organization to support them. President Nibley organized them into an official branch of the church, the first in Alaska, and again began sending missionaries far north on a seasonal basis.
There were members of the church here that many of them didn't even know all the rest of them were members of the church. Some of them were actually teaching Sunday school and other Christian churches because they didn't know there was an LDS church around. So they're teaching the doctrine of the New Testament with a LDS slant to it.
In August of 1940, President Nibley sent the first pair of year-round missionaries, Elder Lauren Fallon and Elder Lester Hewlett, to assist with the branch in Fairbanks. LDS church members in Fairbanks stood out as exceptional individuals and people of prominence. Harry Aaron, for example, was the assistant district attorney for Alaska and later a Supreme Court judge. Dr. Murray Shields was a prominent professor at the University of Alaska and an avid athlete.
And he saw these youth that were out kind of running the streets and causing problems and needed a place to go. And he began organized sports and sporting activities. And in that process, some of the boys he taught how to play sports with joined the church and ended up becoming stake presidents, leaders, judges, all sorts of massive influence with just one man trying to help the boys in the community.
Brother Aaron and his wife Laurie helped introduce the Mutual Improvement Association for the youth in Fairbanks. But it wasn't just an activity for young LDS members. With Elder Hewlett's and Elder Fallon's frequent use of local newspapers and radio, over 130 local youth and adults were in attendance that first evening, and about half that number continued to participate in activities weekly. As favorable stories about the Mormons continued in the media, interest in the LDS faith increased. But it wasn't just hype. These young missionaries set a great example themselves.
The two had a greater influence for the good of the communities than any other people I have known in my nearly 40 years of residence in this territory. We need people like yours to settle here, to give us spiritual balance.
A lot of times the people will tell me, oh, your church is just wonderful. I really like the way they emphasize the family. They know the standards that we have, and they admire that.
Not only have they vastly improved conditions in our branch, but because of their activities, all of the other sects are taking on new life and stirring the people up to a greater interest in religion.
In Anchorage, the church also began to take root. What started as just a 4-member Sunday school in 1938, by 1941 had grown to 32 people meeting for Sunday school in Anchorage's Finn Hall. Additional church members were pouring into the city as part of the increasing military presence there. As a result, Anchorage's first LDS branch was finally organized in May 1941, with 27-year-old Joseph Tippett called as its first branch president. President Tippett gained notoriety 2 years later when he and 3 companions survived a deadly winter plane crash in the mountainous Alaskan wilderness. Their miraculous rescue 4 weeks later made headlines throughout the West. When the missionaries were again recalled in 1941 to assist in the war effort, Alaska had over 300 LDS members. By 1950, the church had grown to 450 members, with additional small branch congregations in Juneau and Palmer. A decade later, their numbers climbed to nearly 3,000, with an additional branch in Ketchikan. On August 13, 1961, the first stake in Alaska was formed, consisting of 3 wards in Anchorage, 1 ward in Palmer, and 2 400 miles north in Fairbanks.
In order to have adequate numbers, they had to include Fairbanks in the stake. So Fairbanks became part of the Anchorage, Alaska stake, and there was a counselor in the stake presidency in Fairbanks, but would participate in stake presidency meetings by phone or travel.
The Anchorage stake continued to grow, and by 1964, it was apparent that a new chapel was needed. 2 weeks before the scheduled groundbreaking for the second Anchorage chapel, there was a major shakeup.
When I got out from the curb into the road, there was just a banging, and the road looked like it was water. You could see wave come, wave come, wave come. And the car was just bouncing, and it was frightening.
This one didn't stop. That's the thing that was unique about this. It just started to go a little like normal, then all of a sudden it got more intense, and it kept going and going.
You couldn't see a chimney fireplace that had not come off. And when that settled down and so many repairs had to be made to homes to get back into them, it was a marvel to see what the saints did. And it was a big thing, and it was really, really well received, thoughtfully received.
With everything shaken except their faith, the LDS Chapel groundbreaking was the first major construction project begun in the state of Alaska after the historic 9.2 magnitude earthquake. A similarly tragic event washed through Fairbanks just 3 years later.
I was the business manager at the University of Alaska, and I got a call from the city of Fairbanks saying, "It's possible there may be flooding in the city. Do you have places on the campus where refugees could come?" And I said very proudly, "Yes, we have 1,800 summer beds that are vacant. Bring them on." Well, within the next 48 hours, we had 7,000 people on the campus.
We helped out in a lot of different areas there at the university. Not only the saints, but just everybody pitched in.
That's one thing about Alaska. You hang together. And in this case, they pitched in round the clock, helping one another.
After the flood was mopped up, things slowly got back to normal and the growth returned. In 1978, the Anchorage, Alaska stake divided into 2 stakes, and the following year, the Fairbanks stake was created in 1979.
Since that time, Fairbanks area has continued to grow. We had a number of buildings constructed.
Building construction contributed greatly to the growth of the LDS Church in Alaska. In 1978, the amiable but insistent Douglas T. Snarr took the reins as mission president. He was a talker, but more than that, he was a doer.
I get a phone call from President Tanner. He said, "President Snarr, I'm from the north. I know how cold it is." Then he said, "President Snarr, I ask you to melt the icebergs."
When he was called to be a mission president, We were delighted because he's a very dynamic person, really a really smart guy, whom we had come to know.
We have an opportunity in Alaska. We can establish ourselves as the church in Alaska, the #1 church in Alaska. If we move decisively now with heart and with muscle.
He was a little different than anybody else I'd ever run into, and he wasn't willing to take no for an answer.
If we could take and put a new building in these places, we'll be the shining light on the hill. And we'll be a somebody instead of just a little scrud running around in these meeting halls with cigarette butts on the floor and the stench of alcohol.
In the more northern reaches, you have what's called permafrost, and that's ground that is frozen a foot or two down permanently. It never thaws. And if you build a building on it, the building is going to move, and it changes the historical environment of the site such that just casting a shadow of the building on the site changes how the soil is going to work.
You build them out of logs, cedar logs, and you get 2 rows of cedar logs on the outside of the building with space in between those 2 rows. You can put insulation in between that. And that way, they stay toasty warm in the wintertime without much heating, and in the summertime, you don't even have to worry about it. They're just the perfect temperature at all times.
And of course, I told him, well, why don't you submit a request for a building? He said, well, I can't because we've only got a handful of saints in the different places where I'd like to build the buildings. And the church policy is you have to have 100 people.
So then they came to me, and they said, the members have got to put money in. That's the way it was in those days, blah, blah, blah. And I said, we're not going to put in 1 cent. We're going to build them ourselves.
And I said, well, you're out of luck then. Well, that didn't mean a bit to him. He wasn't going to quit.
Every single project he had was out of compliance with church requirements. They either didn't have enough money to build, or they didn't have enough members in attendance, or they didn't have enough of either. So Doug, one who wasn't always too observant of church policy, flew to Salt Lake City out of his mission to hand carry his request through the committees.
The presiding bishopric and the brethren on the budget committee, which of course included President Kimball and his counselors, and so they got into it and decided, I guess it was okay to have an exception to policy.
But the answer came back, yes, for 2 buildings. 1 in Seward and 1 in Haines, which is in that panhandle.
He helped design a small chapel that could be parked in those little communities around the state, and that became a big factor. And his trip and his involvement in those small villages was the first by any mission president.
We kind of settled on what you see here, the Panabode buildings, because the members could build it with no building skills.
My husband Don and I helped build the Willow Chapel, and all these little pieces, only they were big pieces, were marked like Lincoln logs, and you just kind of fit them in according to the numbers that were on them and just kind of pounded them in.
I think it was due to his great personality and aggressive desire to benefit the saints that he was successful. I don't think any other person could have done it.
With nearly 24 new buildings being added during the 3 Doug Snar years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was fast becoming that light on a hill. Many others contributed in additional ways, including Alaska Airlines pilot E.T. Pettyjohn, who was able to uniquely minister in the more remote bush areas of Alaska.
He had a small airplane that could land on an airstrip because it had wheels on it, or it could land on a lake or a stream. And it was that let him get out into the bush where he was able to establish branches and get the church started in those outlying areas.
Having accomplished so much, the members now believe more than ever that their desires for a temple could also be realized.
The question was asked of President Hinckley, when will we have the opportunity to have a temple?
He said, well, you'll have a temple when you have enough saints here to have a temple.
He says, double your membership and we'll talk about it.
When I was in Barrow, a member of the church from Salt Lake called me and asked a bunch of interview questions, and one of them was, how far are you from the temple you're assigned to? And I said, one way or round trip? And they said, round trip. I said, 4,600 miles. And they said, no one in the world is that far from a temple. And I said, get out your map.
We were part of the Cardston Temple District, but hardly anyone ever went to Cardston. That was 2,500 miles by road that wasn't paved a good part of the way. So Alaskans tended to go to Hawaii in the winter to the temple, or to visit when they were going out to see family, pass through Seattle.
During the summer of 1997, an Anchorage LDS architect received a phone call from the church temple department.
They rolled out a set of plans. It looked to me like a small temple. And they said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And they would like it if I would help them put it into a set of working drawings. And I was supposed to do all this without telling anyone what was going on.
There just weren't enough people in the church in Alaska to justify a temple. And that's why it was such a big surprise when President Hinckley just nonchalantly told us that we were going to have a temple.
There are many areas of the church that are remote, where the membership is small and not likely to grow very much in the near future. We would construct small temples in some of these areas. We are planning such structures immediately in Anchorage, Alaska.
There was just this spontaneous gasp.
And the entire audience in Fairbanks jumped up and yelled, yeah, yeah.
They stood up and shouted for joy when they announced it in the priesthood meeting. You can't imagine. It's just like giving us the world.
I've never been in a meeting before where the brethren stood up and cheered.
Having a temple here in Anchorage has really helped the people of Alaska to feel a part of the church.
It also helps us as LDS understand our eternal value. And when we understand our eternal value, we treat people differently.
Brought me closer to my Savior. And he definitely was part of doing this work, and I love him.
With a temple in Alaska, most members now felt complete.
In the temple, such a place of peace and love, that you are able to communicate with Father in heaven even more intensely than what we find we're able to do at home or at church.
Although members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today live throughout the state, many remain physically isolated.
Our stake boundaries are somewhere in the range of 250,000 square miles. And so virtually all of our communication or travel, it's not uncommon for us to have people who'll travel 4 or 5 hours to get to and from church.
In the many outlying areas, creativity has been at the heart of leadership. They realized, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them.
And we have something called the Bush Branch. It consists of people who don't live in an organized part of the church, and they're just onesie-twosies throughout Alaska. Although they never see each other, we never meet collectively as a group, we organize them into a branch.
We tried to build a two-way audio system that would connect the district center so that we could have somebody in, say, Whitehorse give the opening prayer, and someone in Sitka give a talk, and someone in somewhere else do something else. And so that's what we tried to do.
In Anchorage and other Alaskan cities, Bush branches function today using teleconference communication.
This is President Anderson, and this is the Bush Branch Sacrament meeting. Our first speaker will be Sister Alston, which is our Young Women President. Then we have our youth speakers.
Thank you, President Anderson. I'm Angie Alston. I live in Breivik Mission with my husband and our 2 children. I teach high school social studies and language arts, and we've been in the Bush Branch for 12 years. I bear testimonies of the Savior Jesus Christ. I know that he lives. I know that he died for us, and I know that it's the atonement that makes it possible for us to live with our Father in heaven again.
Good morning, brothers and sisters. This is Raven Perry, and the lesson I chose to talk about today is how can I be in the world but not of the world?
It's a cold, dark place, and if you're here by yourself, it can be a lonely, lonely place. And so the warmth and the light of the gospel can really fill the gap in that cold, dark place.
Some 34,000 Latter-day Saints currently reside within Alaska, making this the 5th most LDS populous state in the U.S.
We have all the benefits of being LDS in a community that's not predominantly LDS, which I think is a good position to be in.
But there is ice yet to thaw and work yet to do.
I ask you to melt the icebergs.
The Saints in Alaska are up to the challenge.